When David killed Goliath, he became an overnight sensation. I mean, everybody knew David's name because he killed Goliath in front of the entire army, and everybody was talking about David, and not many people were talking about King Saul. In fact, Samuel, who wrote this story for us, says this. He says, in everything he did, talking about David, he had great success. And when Saul, King Saul, saw how successful he was afraid of David. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. And there's an interesting idea here. The people who lead are perceived as the leaders, whether they have the title or not. King Saul had the title king, but David was the one that stepped out and led. And because he led, people began to perceive David as the leader of the army and perhaps the leader of the nation. And perhaps it's true, this is our next king. So Saul realizes he has a problem on his hands, and so he comes up with a way to try to control David to keep things from getting any worse. So he decides he's going to marry one of his daughters off to David, because if he can make David his son-in-law, perhaps he'll be able to control him that way. So he goes to David and says, David, I would love for you to marry into my family, and I'll be your father-in-law. And David responds like this. He says, oh, King Saul, what an honor, but I'm a lowly shepherd boy from a family that's not very important. I'm not worthy of the honor to marry one of your daughters. Well, word of this gets out, and next thing you know, it's Maximus the merciful. No, it's David the humble. David the humble. Can you believe David was so humble that he gave up the opportunity to be a part of the king's family? Well, things continue to go. David gets more and more popular. Saul is more and more jealous. And then one of Saul's daughters fell in love with David. So he thought, I'll try this again. And apparently David had had it for his daughter, this daughter as well, because when he goes to David this time and says, would you marry my daughter? David says, yes, I'll marry your daughter. And Saul says, aha, well, the bride price for my daughter is not an amount of money. It's not herds, it's not sheep, it's not oxen. The bride price for my daughter is 100 dead Philistines. You have to kill 100 Philistines in order to marry my daughter. For Saul said to himself, I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that. It's perfect. There's no way in the world him and his band of merry men are going to kill 100 Philistines and bring back the bloody evidence that they in fact did this. Well, David and his men went out and they killed 200 Philistines and brought back the evidence. Well, this made things even worse for Saul. In fact, Samuel tells us when Saul realized the Lord was with David, and that his daughter Michal actually loved David, which meant Saul was not going to be able to manipulate his daughter to control David, Saul became even still more afraid of David, and he remained his enemy for the rest of his days. Now, here's the connection between all of that and address the mess. David has a big mess on his hands, and here's the unique thing, and here's why it's so relevant to us. David has a big mess on his hands, and it's not his fault. I mean, it's not like the messes I make and the messes you make sometimes, right? He didn't ask to be king. The whole Goliath thing, he was just serving his country. The whole lead out in the campaign things, he's just trying to do what people ask him to do. He refused the king's daughter's hand, but no matter what he does, things get worse and worse and worse, and the mess gets worse and worse and worse. And finally, things escalate to where one afternoon, Saul completely loses it. And he picks up a spear or javelin and he tries to murder David in the palace. And David leaves the palace, runs for his life, heads out into the desert. And from that point on, Saul had it in for David and wanted to kill David. He was jealous. He wanted his son Jonathan to be the next king. And as long as David was alive, he was a threat to the king, he was a threat to the kingdom, and he was a threat to the dynasty that King Saul wanted to leave for his family. When David leaves the city, when David goes out into the wilderness basically to hide, he gathers around him all of Saul's enemies. Saul had many, many, many political enemies. And now David is an outlaw. And he gathers around him literally a band of merry men and some merry women. And before long, everywhere he goes, there's kind of a village following him around. But he's an outlaw. But Saul has not lost his desire to kill David. And this is when the story gets really interesting. This is why you should read your Bible, because it's amazing, isn't it? Okay, so here's where the story picks up. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul is out fighting the Philistines. The Philistines lived along the Mediterranean Sea, right there next to Judea, right next to what we would consider modern-day Israel. And so they were like the Klingons. There was this constant battle back and forth between Israel and the Philistines. And so Saul is returning from a campaign or a battle with the Philistines. His men are bloody. They're tired. They're ready to go home. They're hungry. They've lost friends. And someone gallops up and says, Saul, we have spotted David and his men, and we think we've got him cornered. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats, which was a large spring. Looks something like this. In fact, if you've ever been to the Dead Sea, or you've ever been to Jericho, if you've ever been to the Holy Land, you've been to the area of the desert of En-Gedi, and it looks like this everywhere. There's the Dead Sea. It is just rocks and hills and mountains and caves with some shrub grass, and every once in a while you'll find a spring. So apparently David and his men are at this spring. Saul knows, and he says he's decided this is his opportunity to take care of David. The story continues. He came, talking about Saul and his men came to the sheep pens along the way, and a cave was there, and Saul went into the cave to relieve himself. This is one of the only references in the Bible to going to the bathroom. I tell you that because if you have middle schoolers at home and you're thinking, what would be like a relevant passage of scripture that would be interesting? This may be it for whatever reason. So here's the situation. Saul and his men, they're going along. Saul has to go to the bathroom. He calls a halt to the whole, all 3,000 men and hundreds of other people that followed an army that large. He gets off his mule. Saul rode a mule. He makes his way up a trail, a path, up. He goes into a cave, and while he goes into the cave to use the bathroom, all of his army sits out there and waits patiently. And if you grew up in church, you know what happens next. David and his men were far back in the cave. They're in the very cave. Apparently, here's what happened. When Saul began to come up behind David and his men, one of David's scouts came and warned David and said, David, Saul has discovered us. We need to do something. And David said, instead of outrunning them, let's split up. We'll hide in the caves. We'll hide in these mountains. And when Saul and his group has passed through, we will reassemble and we will go the other way. So David and his closest men are hiding in the very cave that Saul chooses to go into to use the bathroom. Now, here's the question. What are the odds of this? I mean, what are the odds of this? If ever there was a God moment, this is a God moment. If ever God has performed a miracle on David's behalf, this is the miracle that God has performed on David's behalf. If Saul is a stain, God just provided the stain remover. If Saul is the problem, God just provided the solution. What could be any clearer than this? In fact, the men hiding with David back in the cave, they saw this for exactly what they thought it was. God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Here's what they said. The men with David said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. And what they're referring to is this. As David and his men traveled around, they would gather around a campfire at night, and they were tired, they were outlaws, they were poor, they didn't have a place to lay their head. They left their family in different cities around Judea. It was a dangerous lifestyle. And David would say, just be patient. Stick with me. Be patient. Stick with me. One day I'll be king. And if you stick with me until then, when I'm the king, I will reward you, because someday God is going to honor his promise to me and I will be king. And so the men around David are saying, are you kidding me? This is the day that you spoke of. This is the day that you promised. This is the day we've all waited for. And look how God has clearly delivered your enemy into your hands. And imagine what this is going to be like, David. All of those men out there saw Saul walk into the cave, and then they will watch David emerge. Can you imagine the drama? And David, it would be even better if when you emerged from the cave, you held up Saul's severed head. In that moment, they will pledge their lives to you. In that moment, it will be an almost bloodless coup, and you will be king. Can you imagine the drama of that moment as the men wait out there for Saul to return? Well, David gets caught up in the emotion of this, right? I mean, again, how could you not be? I mean, you've been a fugitive, you've been on the run, and now here is your enemy by himself in the most vulnerable position imaginable. I mean, what could be more of a God thing? And so David gets caught up in the emotion, and David decides to do unto him as he intended to do unto me. I'll just do unto him as he intends to do unto me. I mean, no one would blame me. No one would say that I've done something unjust. I'm really just it's an act of self-defense. I'm just going to do unto him as he intends to do unto me. Now, pause the story for just a minute. I want to talk to you about something, then we're going to come back to the story. This is so important, okay? If you've been daydreaming or lost interest, just head back here for just a second, okay? Look. At the root of most messes, associated with most of the messes we make is a breakdown in virtue. You know what virtue is? At the root of most of our messes are associated with most of our messes, the ones we married into, the ones that we created ourselves, the ones we dated our way into, accidentally got ourselves into. At the root of most messes is a breakdown of virtue. Virtue is integrity. Virtue is honesty. Virtue is patience. Virtue is self-control. Virtue is goodness. And when you scratch beneath the surface of any of the messes that we've made, somewhere in that mess, we demonstrated a lack of virtue. There was a breakdown of virtue. In other words, if you ignore virtue, you will eventually make a mess. You ignore virtue and eventually you make a mess. It's just a matter of time. It is cause and effect. It's just an equation. You ignore virtue in a relationship. You ignore virtue in your finances. You ignore virtue in your profession academically. Eventually, you're going to make a mess. And you don't clean up a failure of virtue with another failure in virtue. You don't clean up a flood with more water. You don't clean up a paint spill with more paint. You don't clean up a soap spill with more soap. It does, two wrongs don't make a right, and two messes don't make an unmess. You can't clean up a mess caused by a failure of virtue with another failure of virtue. But here's the problem. Every mess comes with some bad options. And those bad options always involve a failure of virtue. And they are the options we are tempted to reach for quick, because it looks like I can quickly turn this thing around. Somehow I'm going to make this better. Somehow I'm going to fix this. I'll just borrow more money. I'll just lie. I'll just cover the evidence. I'll just ask a friend to vouch for me so that nobody knows where I really was. With every mess, there are options that reflect another failure of virtue. You do not clean up a mess that was created with a failure of virtue by adding another failure in virtue, which was exactly what David was about to do. In fact, the text tells us that David crept up unnoticed. David was a warrior. David was a soldier. This was his sweet spot. This was in his wheelhouse. He would be able to creep up behind King Saul, with King Saul never knowing what happened. All he would feel would be a yank on the back of his hair, and that would be the last breath he would take. And as he's creeping up on King Saul, something dawns on him. I am about to make my mess messier. I'm about to murder the king. I'm about to assassinate my king. I am about to murder God's king. I am about to kill my father-in-law. I'm about to kill my wife's daddy and my children's granddaddy. What in the world am I thinking? And if I murder the king, this will be my story forever. Now, this is where we get trapped. Was that justified? Would he have been justified in killing the king? Well, everybody would say, yes, absolutely. He's trying to kill you. Is it what everybody expected him to do, including his friends in the cave? Absolutely. Was it the right thing? Was it the virtuous thing? Absolutely not. And he was about to add to his story a part of his story that he would be embarrassed to tell for the rest of his life. Granddaddy, tell us again how you became king. Well, your great-grandfather was taking whatever they call that, 1000 BC, and he just walked into the cave. He couldn't see anything. Our eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and your brave granddaddy, I snuck up behind him and grabbed him by the hair and slit his throat, and that's how I became the king. Oh, granddaddy, you are so brave. So David, what happened to my father? We don't know exactly. We're not really sure what happened. He was found in a cave with his throat slit. We don't know what happened. You see, David was about to make a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life, even though it was justified, even though it's what everybody else expected, even though it's what arguably Saul deserved. And there we are. And that's our tension. And that's our dilemma, because every mess comes with some really bad options. Then David crept up and unnoticed. But instead of killing Saul, he cuts off a corner of Saul's robe. And the men who were hiding back in the cave cannot believe what they're seeing. As David gets closer, all of a sudden he stops, reaches over and takes Saul's robe that Saul had discarded, cuts off a corner, and then sneaks back into the cave. And then when he gets back, the text tells us that it bothered David's conscience, that cutting off a corner of Saul's robe bothered him, because even doing that was an offense to the king. Attacking anything a king owned was like attacking the king himself. Afterwards, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe, and he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master," what? "The Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." Hey guys, I almost forgot. God put him in place. And I have no business replacing what God put in place. I have no business replacing what God put in place. It is not my responsibility to replace what God put in place. And I don't want to become king by murdering the king. Well, when he said this, the men around him said, "Well, you may feel bad about it. We don't feel bad about it. Let us do it. You don't want his blood on your hands. We would love to have his blood on our hands. We will do what you are unwilling to do." But with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul, and Saul left the cave and went his way. Now, if you think it's been a good story so far, and you think it's been dramatic so far, what happens next is unreal. Somebody needs to make a movie around just to get to this scene. It is so extraordinarily powerful. So let's back up. So we're sitting out, we're sitting on our donkeys and our mules and our horses, and oh my gosh, is it hot. The hot sun right down there in the Dead Sea Valley, in that basin, waiting. Finally, here comes Saul. "Are you done yet?" And nobody makes eye contact. Everybody pretends like we don't know why we stopped here, Here comes Saul. He's got his robe on, make his way down. Somebody comes and gives him 2 hands. He steps up, gets on his mule, and they're about to leave, and David appears in the mouth of the cave and says, "Yoo-hoo! Yoo-hoo!" And everybody, I don't know if he did that or not, everybody turns, because the text tells us, then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul. And everybody looks, and Saul turns, and Saul's older, and he squints, and he says to his young companion, he says, "Is that who I think it is?" And he says, "Yes, your highness. It is your son-in-law, David." And everybody in Saul's army knew immediately what had just not happened. Can you imagine this? Here's what Samuel says happened next. David gives a little speech. Here's a piece of the speech. "This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands. God brought you. God delivered you up into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. Not only did I not kill you, I kept other men. I defended you. Saul, I just did for you what your bodyguard standing around you now failed to do. Shame on your bodyguard. I have protected your life in a way that they failed to do." This is unbelievable. I said to them, "I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. You may not be acting like the Lord's anointed. You may be a sorry example of the Lord's anointed, but you are the Lord's anointed, and I'm not going to replace what God put in place." And then he says something that some of you listening and some of you watching and some of you in the room, you need to just lock and load on this. This is so important. David says, "May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord judge between you and me. I'm not your judge. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, because you have wronged me. There's no mistake about that. But my hand will not touch you. Oh my gosh. I mean, David's reputation in the community, if it could have not, I mean, how could it get any higher? Now it is David the merciful, David the merciful, David the merciful. Essentially what David said to Saul and the soldiers, essentially what he communicated to them was simply this: I'm opting for virtue over hurt you. I'm opting for virtue over hurt you. I've done something a mere mortal wouldn't do. I'm doing something unheard of. I've taken the high road in a way that no one could even imagine. I've acted in such a way that puts me almost in a category of one. Well, what can Saul do? He's completely humiliated. His bodyguard is completely humiliated. His soldiers are in awe of David. Saul knows at any minute they may just declare David king, because they've never seen anything like this. This is completely unheard of in a world of bloodshed where death came easy and life was cheap. So Saul says back to David, essentially, today it's evident to all of us that you are a better man than me. And Saul turns around and heads back to Jerusalem. And 7 chapters later, a random Philistine arrow pierces Saul's armor and he dies. And David becomes the king of Israel. This is what I want to make sure you don't miss today. Every mess comes with a prepackaged list of bad options. Every mess comes prepackaged with some bad options. Every mess comes prepackaged with some bad options. And if you choose a bad option, you will make your mess messier.